So, hello and welcome to a special episode of Planet Holyrood. I'm Paul Hutchin, political editor of the Daily Record, joined this week by Alex Cole-Hamilton, who's the leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, and this is the second leaders interview that we've run over the last couple of weeks. So, welcome, Alex. What are your thoughts on the latest revelations surrounding the Peter Mandelson scandal and the Prime Minister's lack of judgment?
Well, this is clearly a scandal that the Prime Minister can't get past. And we've heard revelations about the vetting process. I mean, I think listening to people in my family who aren't that political, who watched the Ollie Robbins stuff yesterday, they think that he's been treated quite unfairly. I don't think that the Prime Minister will be able to put this to bed. And all of the commentary you're hearing around it is about how he can't survive. And this is a massive distraction from the issues that matter to people in this Holyrood election campaign, whether that's the cost of living emergency, the Scottish education getting it back to its best and driving down the crisis in our health service. The more we're talking about the Prime Minister and his moribund career, then the less we're talking about the issues that really matter to Scots.
Speaking of Labour contacts, I think there's an assumption that the Prime Minister might resign after May 7th. What impact do you think it would have on the election if he was to resign today?
I mean, I don't think it would have a massive impact other than it would swamp the news coverage. And again, I think that's to the detriment of the issues that we're trying to discuss here, the problems on Scotland's doorstep, which we need Scottish solutions to. I think Anas is already insulated from attacks on Starmer because of his resignation call in February. But at the end of the day, I think the more that this psychodrama rumbles on in London, we aren't talking about the crisis in social care, which keeps 2,000 Scots in hospital beds who don't need or want to be there every night, and the rising cost of living, the issues affecting our schools, and indeed the ferries fiasco, which we've seen laid island and coastal communities low over the crucial Easter holiday period.
So there's 15 days to go. The polls have generally showed pro-independence majority or an SNP majority. There was one at the weekend that showed a narrow pro-UK majority. Clearly, you're confident that the Lib Dems are going to win extra seats. Do you think that ultimately, though, it's going to be either Anas Sarwar or John Swinney as First Minister?
Well, let's just unpack that. We are going to make a big leap forward. We're coming to this election just after the best election for Liberals in 100 years, at the general election, where we overtook the Tories. We came within touching distance to the SNP and trebled our seats. We're going to do the same again in those 10 key constituencies where we've got the beating of the SNP. And you'll know where, if you're living in one, because you hear from us all the time, and they're right across the Highlands, in East Dunbartonshire, Strathkelvin and Bearsden in particular, across Edinburgh and in Fife. We've got the beating of the SNP. But for the first time in a long time, the polls suggest that if wherever you live, you can use your second peach-coloured regional ballot to elect a Lib Dem MSP with change, with fairness at heart. And ultimately, that's what I'm focused on right now.
But after May the 7th, do you agree that it's only going to be Anas Sarwar or John Swinney?
So, I mean, ultimately, after May, the voters have got to have their say, and that's what I'm focused on right now. I hope that we don't have another term, a third decade of SNP administration. And if there's arithmetic there which allows us to affect a kind of change which speaks to our values, then of course we'll look at it. But right now I'm just focused on delivering those 10 constituencies and peach votes right across the country.
I mean, you've been very critical of the SNP's record in government.
Yeah.
If they're so bad, why are they not on 15% of the vote rather than 35%?
I think in a lot of cases, their voters aren't paying attention. They still hold their nose and vote for the SNP to back independence. And that's why you're hearing John Swinney relentlessly talking about another divisive push for an independence referendum, because he knows he can't fight on his record. Why? Because school attainment is still terrible in terms of the gap between rich and poor kids, because the ferries, we had 8 CalMac vessels out of commission because the SNP completely mishandled the ferry replacement process, leaving islanders and coastal communities high and dry. They've not duelled the A9 when they said they would in 2007. NASA put a man on the moon faster. And by any metric, they've failed right across the dashboard of public policy. So of course they're fighting a core vote strategy on independence, and they know it works for the people that will tolerate almost anything.
Big core vote, though.
Well, nevertheless, I mean, that's why they're leaning into it. But I think they're overpriced. I think that we're seeing signs this will be a low turnout election. And I think that harms them more than they are going to expect.
I mean, you're against independence, you're against IndyRef 2.
Yeah.
Would you accept that for an awful lot of people in Scotland, it is an unresolved issue?
I certainly do, and I recognise that, and I respect their right to hold that view. But at the end of the day, for myself and for all of the Liberal Democrat MSPs elected in what I hope will be a much expanded group, we will all have a personal mandate from the people who send us to Parliament, the people who give us our instructions, to explicitly oppose a second referendum. Why? Because we fundamentally believe in working together with our nearest neighbours, in political unions and social unions with the rest of the UK. We want a closer union with Europe. But ultimately, we aren't serving any of our constituents if, as John Swinney says in grand terms, that he wants to have a referendum in 2028. The next 18 months are spent talking about the Constitution and that independence referendum. We'll not be talking about how we get 2,000 Scots out of hospital who don't need to be there, or how we dual the A9, or how we fix the ferries, or how we insulate cold Scottish homes and drive down energy bills.
So are there any circumstances that you could support a second independence referendum at any point in the future?
No. Because it's not a policy I believe in. I mean, ultimately, it's not for me to offer a pathway to the SNP and as to how they get a second independence referendum. It just wastes so much political oxygen. It's not why I'm in politics. I respect it. I'm a Democrat.
So basically, never.
Well, I wouldn't ever vote for another independence referendum. We've had that discussion, and it's also held Scotland back. It's why our public services are failing, why we've got this terrible record of the SNP in government, because they're never focused on the day job.
I mean, you're a Democrat. You're a Democrat.
Yeah,
surely Scots should know what the route is to IndyRef 2.
Well, but they also know that if they vote for a Lib Dem, they're backing a party that doesn't support independence. I mean, it's a really interesting one, right? Because think of another policy. Say, for example, the public supported capital punishment, and they wanted to know what's the route for it. No, I'm not going to compare. Actually,
I just did.
Oh my goodness! Actually, I roll that back because it's not a fair comparison. I can see your eyes twinkling there. Or just another policy that we don't support. I'm not going to offer my opponents a valid route to get there because it's just something I fundamentally disagree with. Let me say,
you did the
for
first
the avoidance
time
of
around,
doubt, I don't think independence is like capital punishment.
But you did support a referendum eventually. The first time around.
But then we were told it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and a once-in-a-generation, all of that. And it's not for me to set out terms by which the SNP can meet the threshold test for another referendum. It's just not what's important to the voters of this country.
But it is to about 35 to 40% of them. Isn't it the case? While this is unresolved, while there's this constant block in IndyRef 2, we're always going to have a result like this, which is the SNP way out in front.
Oh, I don't agree with that, because ultimately people are turning away from the SNP. I think the opinion pollsters are ringing around the voters of this country, asking who people support. And yeah, I would say that SNP probably consistently enjoy about 30 to 35% support. But those polls don't pick up motivation. And I can tell you now, they're going to have a real turnout problem. They're really struggling to motivate their base. Nobody actually believes John Swinney is going to deliver an independence referendum in 2028, and they're not going to go for it.
Just on tactical voting, I do think it's a bit odd that the pro-UK parties don't sort of work together when it comes to certain types of seats. Now, clearly you've got a chance in a lot of Highland constituencies in Edinburgh as well, but you've got no chance of winning a seat in Glasgow. Why don't you say vote Labour in those Glasgow constituencies?
Because there are reasons I'm not a member of the Labour Party. We're a very different proposition. At the same time, I think the people of this country are very sophisticated, and they understand that actually the Liberal Democrats at this election are only in good shape to beat the SNP in those 10 target constituencies across the Highlands, across Eastern Berkshire, Fife and in Edinburgh. But I want voters everywhere. I think people can vote for us with confidence again, knowing that we are truly a national party. And that's the point. I think if you're going to style yourself as a national party, you need to run everywhere. That's why I think, the Greens are getting off lightly with the fact that they're not standing in 70 constituencies. But, people will recognise that you've got 2 votes in this election. You can use them strategically if you want to, but I'm asking people to vote Lib Dem everywhere. But in those 10 key constituencies, we've got the beating of the SNP. But for the first time in a long time, that second peach-coloured regional ballot is going to deliver change with fairness at its heart.
Isn't there a structural problem, though, with the electoral system in terms of the pro-UK side? So most MSPs are elected through the constituencies first past the post. You have 4 pro-UK parties. effectively up against 1.25 because the Greens are only standing, I think, 6 seats.
And I do think that the Holyrood voting system is broken and will be proven at this election to be broken. Now, some polls, as you have rightly said, point to the possibility of an SNP majority. I actually don't think that's realistic, but let's say it is. That does happen. There's a possibility they got to an overall majority in the Scottish Parliament on 35% of the vote. That would be a democratic outrage, an abomination, and it shows that the fundamental system that we use is broken. So I think that's why Lib Dems have always suggested we need single transferable vote for the Scottish Parliament in the same way that we elect our councils. So which will almost certainly reflect in a more accurate way the political makeup and values of this country.
So changing the electoral system is a big move in any sort of parliament, any circumstance. What is the mechanism for doing that? By which you mean, how do you go about it?
Well, obviously, the Scottish Parliament's a creature of the Scotland Act, but the Scottish Parliament, I think, can still change the voting system and the franchise through an act of the Scottish Parliament if it wanted to. That
I think it was devolved. I think
it would need a 2/3 majority. But I think that if the SNP came close to an overall majority with 35% of the vote, now I can see why they wouldn't want to vote for that, but the case for that would almost become unanswerable. So we'd need that change.
I mean, I think the SNP would probably resist it fiercely. Would you support...
Turkeys don't vote for Christmas.
Well, I mean, would you support Westminster legislating in that area?
Well, I don't, but as we've discussed, it's now been devolved. It would need a sole motion, which would require legislative consent. I think that would create a constitutional bonfire. But at the same time, it's our policy to take it. It's in our manifesto. I think that... and I don't imagine if there is nearly an SNP majority on 35% of the vote, they would go for it in this parliament. But it's the clamour for that change will become louder and louder and louder. And ultimately, I think we'll win through.
So you want to be in government, implementing your policies. Let's look at the last time the Lib Dems were in government at a UK level. So some of the policies included the bedroom tax, cutting the top rate of income tax, cutting inheritance tax. That was a record of shame, wasn't it?
So I wasn't involved in politics at the time. I wasn't elected. I was a youth worker and I was dealing with a lot of the fallout from some of those coalition government politics. And we got some of that wrong. There's no question. Had I been in the room, then I would have pushed back. I would have hoped that we would have done things differently. But I recognise we let people down in that. And like I say, I dealt with some of that as a youth worker. We did get some good things out of it as well. You know, there was the income tax threshold increases did more to address poverty than 13 years of government. Not my words, they were the words of the government, the Guardian. But I recognise, look, it's 16 years now since we entered that coalition. A lot of water has moved under the bridge, and I think that the public have forgiven us. Why do I say that? Because we came into the, in the general election in 2024, we had the best result for Liberals across these islands in 100 years. 72 MPs, 6 in Scotland, which is treble what we had. We overtook the Tories and we came within touching distance the SNP. So I think the public have moved on, but I recognise the missteps that we made in that time.
So if you were to enter government, what lessons would you learn from the coalition? I mean, would you have to strike a harder bargain in terms of like a partnership agreement? Would you have to box more clever once you're in government? I mean, when you look back on that period, what do you think were the sort of main strategic errors that the Lib Dems made that you wouldn't make again?
So this is, I'm really happy to get involved in hypothetical discussions like this after the election, but my focus right now is getting...
you want to be in government, people want to know how you behave in government.
Well, look, I mean, I got into politics to get stuff done. That's what you get with the Lib Dems. We're a party that rolls up our sleeves, cares about our community and just gets to work. And that's about laying aside differences and finding common ground where we can. And I think the people of this country were warm to that. They recognise in a parliament of minorities that's needed. But I'm not going to start sort of laying out our negotiating strategy for a future government or identifying the problems of coalition last time. I think first and foremost, a lot of this is about keeping your word, sticking to what you said you'd do, and sticking to being clear on what you wouldn't do.
Do you think that the first coalition that you had with Labour, in the early years of it was a better example of coalition than the one that you had with the Conservatives?
I don't need to think that. I know that, and that's because actually our vote share went up at the end of that Parliament. People recognised that we were acting as the grown-ups in the room. We were working well with Labour. Jim Wallace was an excellent Deputy First Minister, and people rewarded us at the ballot box.
I mean, I'm just clearly you're not going to go into government with the SNP. I can't imagine you'd go into government with the Greens. Reform are off the table. The Tories are off the table. So your most likely coalition partner would be Labour. But I read Labour's manifesto, and there are policies there that are simply, they wouldn't be acceptable to your party. A national care service, reducing the number of health boards, elected mayors doesn't sound like a particularly liberal thing to do. Is it not the case that there are sort of irreconcilable differences between Labour and the Lib Dems?
Well, there are big
beyond your good relationship with Anas Sarwar.
I mean, there are big differences for sure. Let me be clear. There's no pacts or alliances with Labour at this election. I'm just focused on those 10 target seats and winning right across the peach vote, which we should do handsomely. But I think in the final analysis, the people of this country would want parties in a minority context to roll up their sleeves and find common ground where it exists. That doesn't mean surrendering our commitment and our opposition to things like a national care service. Let's explain to people listening to this what our problem with that is. Now, everyone talks about the National Care Service like it's a mirror image of our most treasured national possession, which is the NHS. Nonsense. A national care service would not make social care free at the point of delivery. It doesn't make care a profession of choice and attract workers into the profession. When the SNP wasted time and money, £30 million, designing a national care service that was really just a massive ministerial takeover of vast and unnecessary bureaucracy, which asset stripped local communities, local health and social care partnerships from being able to deliver the care that they needed. Nothing improved about our care sector. And actually, COSLA, so the Coalition of Scottish Local Authorities, and Social Work Scotland both opposed it. All the stakeholders opposed it. I visited Margaret McGill in the far north of Scotland at the start of the campaign. People who follow Scottish politics will know I've raised her case several times with John Swinney directly at FMQs. She had lost the use of her legs. She's a former care worker herself, lost the use of her legs 16 months ago. She was only meant to spend 4 months in hospital and ended up spending 14 months in hospital, or an extra year in hospital rather, after her home was adapted and she was declared fit enough to go home. Why? Because there were no care workers to service her village in the far north, towards Wick. So, I mean, she's not alone. That case cost the NHS £200,000, keeping her in her hospital when she didn't need or want to be there. There are 2,000 Scots like Margaret in hospital every night. It's costing the NHS £1.2 million a day. And actually, nothing about the National Care Service will put a dent in that delayed discharge. Again, it's about controlling things from the centre, which Lib Dems fundamentally oppose.
Completely different subject, Alex. Anas Sarwar said that he regrets voting for GRR. Do you regret it?
No. And a humane approach to gender recognition is still an unanswered question. And I recognise that the division this has caused in our society. So we're not looking to relitigate this in the next Parliament. I think this needs to be allowed time to settle and just to find its level. And then ultimately, we will circle back to this on a foreign nations basis, because we don't want to cross equalities legislation, and address it like that. But I don't regret it, because I think there was a lot of discussion about what it was and what it wasn't. I mean, let's be clear, gender recognition reform is not a passport. It doesn't allow you into a place you weren't allowed yesterday. It just allows trans people the dignity of having the state reflect who they were in the documents they're required to hold, a birth certificate, a death certificate. And I don't think there's any problem with that. But I recognise that by pursuing that now, we'd be painting a bigger target on the backs of the people that we're trying to help. Let me say this, final thing. We accept the Supreme Court judgment on the definition of a woman. We're still waiting, obviously, for the guidance and the court cases that follow that to see what that means for our society. I hope that doesn't end up meaning that people feel uncomfortable using the bathroom in public spaces. But the biggest threat to women in our society, in public spaces right now, is not the trans community, it's not trans people, it's predatory men. And for all the time we're discussing this and divided on this, we're not discussing what we do to prevent men's violence against women and girls.
I mean, one of the issues that came up during the GRR debate was this issue of bad actors. So from your perspective, do you think that Isla Bryson is a man or a woman?
Well, I think her mother said that she was a man, or Isla Bryson's a man. There you go. And I think that's been settled. But the Isla Bryson case was quite interesting because ultimately she was being held in solitary confinement in Cornton Vale. That was a decision by SPS. It wasn't a blanket decision by SPS. I think at the time there were 11 trans women in the Scottish prison estate, 9 of whom were housed in the male estate. And that's because of the dynamic risk assessment done by SPS. They felt that was the right place for them to go. I'm not going to say that politicians should decide who's sent to which prison. That should be a decision for SPS, but it feels like that was handled badly.
One of the main issues that came up towards the end of the last term was assisted dying. Your colleague, Liam MacArthur, brought forward a bill. It didn't pass in the end. Do you think assisted dying legislation will be brought back in the next term of the Scottish Parliament?
Well, personally, I hope so, because I care about it. It's something I want to see changed. And for as long as Scots are being denied the right to a good death, this is another unanswered question. Look, palliative care is amazing, but it isn't available to everyone. We should certainly, in the intervening period, make sure it is available to everyone, but it still doesn't touch the sides of pain for some people. Some Scots will always be denied the right to a good death. And this isn't a Lib Dem policy. I'll allow my MSPs a free vote on this. But for me personally, I want to know that if I reach the end of my life in uncontrollable pain, beyond the reach of palliative care, that I should have the right to say this far and no further and end my own life in dignity.
What do you make of the MSPs who changed their minds at the last minute?
I'm not going to judge them for that. I mean, I recognise that there were some people who voted for it at stage 1 who, in good faith, wanted to be persuaded but weren't quite there yet. And so they were allowed at the parliamentary time, and for whatever reason, we didn't get them over the line. I'm not going to turn on people who, I know spent a long time thinking about it and agonising over it. I just think they're out of step with public opinion. It's one of these strange policies where the Parliament is so far behind where the public is. The public is polled again and again and again, and it will be in the 70s or 80% of people that support the right for people to choose the manner of their own passing.
You said that you hope that it comes back in the next term. Do you think that there should be a 2-3 year gap between the bill failing and the next one being introduced?
I think that's probably likely in any case, because I think the supporters of the bill would want to dust ourselves down, understand where we were in terms of the new parliament and whether there was a majority for it. But it's not for me to arbitrarily dictate the timeline for this. I hope it comes back in this parliament. I'm prepared to wait, but it is something that will come back. And ultimately, I hope we'll win.
Is it your prediction that MSPs will legalise assisted dying in the next term?
It's just a matter of time.
And are you confident it'll happen next time?
I couldn't say that, because really that sort of dictates the strategy, and we need to, people haven't had their say as to who to vote for yet, so we don't know what the new parliament will look like. I know that there will be organisations out there in short order working out where the new parliament sits on this, and if it's finally balanced, then there's probably a case for letting it lie for a term. But if it's overwhelmingly in favour, I don't see there's any impediment to bringing it back. There's no rule that stops us from bringing it back. So I would like to see it.
Final question before our quick fire questions. We've been talking a lot about the election. What's your prediction for the number of Lib Dem MSPs?
I'm not going to put a ceiling on it, but we are going to take a massive leap forward. We'll be into double figures. I'm hopeful that we can overtake the Scottish Conservative Party. Some polling suggests we can overtake the Greens. But yeah, and I think we are there or thereabouts in our 10 target seats. So that's the baseline. And then on that second peach-coloured regional ballot, for the first time in a long time, the polls are suggesting we could pick up everywhere. So everyone can have the benefit of a hardworking, community-led Lib Dem MSP. 5
final questions. Number 1, when was the last time you cried?
Oh my goodness. Oh, it was assisted dying. It was listening, actually, funnily enough, it was listening to Lorna Slater talking about her father's medically assisted death in Canada. And it was one of the most moving things I've ever heard in the Parliament. I mean, we were all very tired because of the late night sittings, but I was ugly crying by the end of that.
When was the last, this is number 2, when was the last time you changed your mind on a policy issue?
I think I was asked about this morning, actually, and I think it would probably be around nuclear power. So as a teenager and a young adult, I'd always been quite opposed to new nuclear. But I recognise the importance of energy security, importance of clean energy security, the fact that tech around SMR, small modular reactors, has improved in terms of waste recycling. And I think, I'm willing to be persuaded that that can be part of the mix. I have seen firsthand Russian aggression. I drove an ambulance to the armed forces of Ukraine last year overland over 35 hours. It's 3 tanks of petrol away. And I could see, from the wreckage of Ukraine, just what a threat Russia is to our way of life. So that means energy security has to be right up there in terms of government priority. And we shouldn't have sacred cows about this. We shouldn't be ideological about this. If the tech's improved on the processing of waste, I think it's clearly part of the mix.
Number 3, do you consider Sandy Peggy to be a hero?
So this is quite a sensitive case. I mean, I've not considered her. Define hero. What do you mean by that?
Do you think that the stand that she took was heroic?
No, I wouldn't consider her a hero, but I don't have any animosity towards her. I think, she took a view about how she, a circumstance that none of us have a private insight into. The courts found there was kind of blame in both directions. And look, I think that the more we have these judgments, the more that we understand the landscape of how our approach to trans rights and female rights can intercede. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. As I go back, I don't think the threat to women in public spaces comes from trans people. I think it comes from predatory men, and we need to do something about that. But no, I don't think she is a particular hero or villain. No.
Number 4, was Alex Salmond a good man?
I struggle with that. I have met some of his complainers, and I know how he made them feel. So I struggle with that.
Finally, what is your biggest vice?
Ha! My goodness. So I used to like a drink, but I've actually not had a drink since New Year's Eve because I'm absolutely focused on this election. My biggest vice, I think definitely food related. Probably I can't resist. You know what? I can't really resist like a nice Mellis's cheese board or George Muse cheese board. So that's a bit lame, but there you go.
Here we go. All right. Thanks, Alex. Thanks to Alex for joining me. And thanks also to Daryl from the Records video team who produced this episode. You can listen to Planet Holyrood on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or watch it on the Daily Record YouTube channel. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok for the latest news and the best bits of the podcast.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.